Hi creatives, today's video is all about picking the right fonts for your projects, how to know where to find fonts, and how to recognize a really good option for your projects. We're launching our newsletter today, so in celebration of that, I have created a cheat sheet with all of my favorite type foundries, fonts, all of that good stuff. So you can download that in the description if you like. Let's start with a quick explanation of some of the terms around typography and fonts, because it can be quite useful to know when you're picking different options and when you're searching specifically. The first one is font versus typeface. This one's pretty simple. A typeface is a style of letter, and the fonts are just different weights of that same typeface. You also have different categories of typefaces like sans serif, serif, display, script, mono, and handwriting, for example. Some are pretty straightforward, like handwriting, but some are a little bit more complex, so let's have a look at some of those. Display typefaces, for example, is a way to describe typefaces that are meant to be used for eye-catching designs, like titles and quotes, but they're not a great option for body copy. Serif and sans serif refer to the presence or absence of serifs, the little kind of extensions that you see on many traditional typefaces, and especially for options that should feel a little bit more sophisticated. Slab serifs are sometimes referred to as sans serifs with added serifs, which sounds super confusing, but they are characterized by very geometric mono-thickness serifs that are very angular often. You also have more experimental concepts like reverse contrast typefaces that play with how we are used to seeing letters be constructed. So since letter styles originated from writing, the thicker lines should be where we press down harder, typically when we go down rather than up on the page. So with reverse contrast, you have the opposite, which can create kind of an interesting impression, but it can also be harder to pull off. So now that we know a little bit about the terminology, which fonts should you actually choose? I like to think about this from 5 different criteria. The very first one is readability. So we want to make sure that we're starting with accessibility and that the typefaces that we're choosing are going to work for lots of different people. If you have a typeface with a very ornate style or one that has some areas that are super thin, that can make the typeface quite difficult to read. And a good way to test it out is just to squint at your screen, and if you can still read it, then usually it is quite legible. The next criteria is to think about how appropriate the typeface is for the industry that you're working with. So for example, if you're working for a beauty line that has a very young target audience, having a very ornate typeface for titles could be a great choice to bring a lot of branding and character to that brand. But let's say you're working for a real estate agent with a much older audience, for example, and a much more serious tone, you might not want to use that ornate of a typeface. So have a think about the context that you're designing for. And I think this comes both with looking at research, so what are other brands in the same industry doing, but also after a couple months and years just looking at lots and lots of typefaces, you'll start getting kind of like a gut feeling for what is appropriate and what isn't. Next, we want to think about how many languages the typeface is available in. So if it's a very tried and tested typeface, then likely it does come in lots of languages and lots of special characters. But sometimes when we find one that has maybe only been created as one font, we might want to have a look at how that is going to work, because a lot of things like, let's say with websites, auto-translate into other languages. And then we want them to be able to use the typeface to keep that branding consistent. The next criteria is looking at how good the typeface is at kerning and creating that nice, visually appealing way of spacing between the different characters. So you might have experienced that you found a typeface that looks beautiful when it's written out in a word in the Foundry that you're looking at, for example, or on Envato Elements. And then you download it and you notice like, oh, actually when I'm typing out between A and N, it's having an issue. It's way too big of a spacing, for example. So sometimes we have these really specific problems where it just doesn't feel balanced. And this is something that can happen, and we need to just have a think about it, because as we're designing things like logos and poster designs, we have full control. We can actually manually change that, so that's totally fine. But if we're handing something over to a client and they're going to use it on, their computers, on their website, for example, then you actually don't control that. So then you want to make sure that you have a typeface that is going to work really nicely in all contexts. The last thing to consider is price, and there are so many different options here, so I want to talk you through some of them. The first option is to use a free font from a place like Google Fonts or FontShare, for example. They share a lot of really good options that have been tried and tested and are gonna last. And here we have so many good options that are good for a client that maybe don't have a giant budget to buy a license for a font. It also makes it really flexible if, let's say, your client already works a lot in Google's products like Google Slides and Google Drive. So that is something that can be a really good pro there. The next option is to use a paid option like Creative Market or Envato Elements, or my favorite, to go directly to Foundries to look for typefaces. This is an amazing way to get a lot more options, and the paid options, especially from Foundries, often have more weights and special characters for different languages. And you are also supporting another creative business, which is really great. Do keep in mind that just because you have a license that works for your business, it doesn't mean that you can automatically pass that on to your client, so they will need to get a license of their own. So when you buy a license, it will specify for how many desktops that it can be used on. So just keep an eye that you're not, let's say, downloading something that you have a license for and then keep passing it on to multiple clients. So always make sure that you're legally protected there. This is also a great thing to keep in mind when you're creating a budget for the project, that if you gauge that they have a little bit more of a budget, you can put a buffer in there to make sure you have money to buy a specific typeface if you think that would be a good idea. And if that's not an option to start with and you find something you think would be a really, really good fit, you can always bring that up and ask them, hey, here's a typeface that I think would be a great fit. It's this much. Would you like to add it to the budget? The third one is a really exciting option that I think a lot of us don't think about that much, and that is to either commission a foundry to create a custom typeface for your branding project, or to create one yourself. One of my favorite examples of this is for the brand Symphony, created by the design studio Collins. They created a typeface that can be modified to animate in different shapes and proportions to mimic the instruments and music from the orchestra. This is such a beautiful use of custom type because it really makes the brand. Creating typefaces is its craft on its own with so many little details. So if that's not your main craft, I suggest we stick to the ones that already exist, but it can be a really fun task to play around with and see if it's something you can incorporate into your branding projects or have a budget to hire a foundry. So what about pairing typefaces? The absolutely safest way to always get it right is to stick to one typeface and use different weights within that typeface. Typically, a really good option is to use bold or extra bold for titles and regular or medium for the body copy. But you can still have fun and play around with things like italics or using all caps for things like buttons or pre-titles. And there's lots of different ways to keep that one typeface but have a lot of options within it. This means that it will always work well together and you never have to worry about them clashing with each other. If you want to combine different fonts, you want to find ones that complement each other. One really great way to do this is to use one serif and one sans serif. So for example, Baskerville Libre for titles and Montserrat for body text, for example. A really great resource for pairings like this, and lots of pairings in general, is a site called FontPair. Here you can navigate according to categories, and all of the options you see are free to download from Google Fonts. In some cases, I think it can be a really good idea to have a core set of typefaces and fonts that you're using for things like titles, buttons, and body copy. But then if it's a brand that is very expressive, let's say we have an ice cream store and they have a shop that needs lots of typographical expression and packaging that needs to be really playful, we can add on other fonts that are a little bit more specifically used. So this way your social media and websites and places that need to be a little bit more readable don't have to get messy or cluttered or overly complicated with these fonts, but you can still use them in a way that brings a lot of character. When it comes to picking fonts and typography for a brand, I think it's all a sense of balance and making sure you have enough flexibility, but still have that sense of that core brand. Before we say bye, I want to share two of my absolute favorite type foundries, so you can go and get inspired and find ideas for your own projects. The first one is called Commercial Type, and they have such a great selection of fonts that feel really timeless. If you need that perfect friendly sans serif or a really good slab typeface, go and check them out. My next one is called VJ Type, and they have absolutely beautiful statement typefaces. Something about many of them just gives me a Wes Anderson feeling, and they're also the perfect choice for bold magazine design or custom packaging when you want the type to carry the design. I'll make sure to link these foundries and all of the other resources that I mentioned down in the description. I hope this sparked some inspiration for your own project, and I would love to hear what your biggest challenge with picking the right typefaces is. Let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your projects and see you next time.